Master, we must go. We must go. Do you have it? Do you have it? We must go and to the mountain, Master.
Oh, must we?
Yes. Yes. Master has the precious. Master has it.
Okay.
Master has the precious.
I do.
Oh, good. Okay. We must take it. We must take it and go. Are you ready?
I don't.
We goes to self-improvement at the Hopkinton Public Library.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Genre of the Month. As you may have noticed, this month we are talking about fantasy, specifically high fantasy, with my, may I say, fantastic Gollum impression. Here today I have Jack Miller, who is our assistant director. She is joining me to talk about this genre. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jack.
Thank you, Danielle, for having me. So I know that high fantasy is really your jam, and it's something I like too. But I'm more into some of the crossover stuff. So can you tell me exactly what high fantasy is?
Sure. So high fantasy, you're right, is something that I really, truly enjoy. It is the sort of fantasy that most people think about when they think about fantasy. So things like The Lord of the Rings, obviously, which we referenced in our skit. It's got that really big built-out world with just tons and tons of lore. It's got elves, it's got dwarves, it's got dragons. It's got really epic quests. So oftentimes the stakes of these books are to save the world or to save a people or to save a nation. These are often stories that are like deep into the nitty-gritty of people's lives. It's about the battle between good and evil and how that reshapes an entire world.
That makes some sense. But what if folks like other things that say sci-fi or other aspects in other genres? Is there some crossover between the two?
Absolutely, yeah, there's tons of crossover, and fantasy is seeing a huge crossover moment right now, even in high fantasy. So obviously we've talked about The Lord of the Rings, but there are things like a Game of Thrones, which while it kind of has that big built out world, it really focuses on those individual characters and you get a little bit more of that personal feel to it. There are also things like The Witcher, where it follows a certain character throughout this big world, and the actions that character takes and the character around them takes changes the world, but it's still got that depth of lore and that deep sense of like a lived in world. And of course, The Witcher and Game of Thrones have dragons, they have monsters, they have beasts, they have that sort of like big fantasy feel to them. But again, we talked about how crossovers are a little bit more your genre. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? And also how high fantasy shows up in YA and children's literature?
Oh, definitely. So let's probably talk about the main thing is romantasy is a big thing, and high fantasy, the thing I can kind of touch on is I have something here by Sarah J. Maas, and that's romantasy. Definitely high fantasy, though. We're dealing with a group of people, they're fae, or fairies, that sort of elvish folk, things like that, that you see in a lot of high fantasy, but there's a heavy romance element. But once again, dealing with the same ideas of we're defending against the worlds of evil is coming down upon, in this case, Valeris is the, realm that they're protecting, that sort of thing. Victoria Aveyard, very similar. Both of these are in the YA or new adult realm, which is where a lot of the romantasy elements kind of exist.
And I feel like romantasy works really, really well as a genre blend, because in the high and epic fantasy, you've got this sense of romance and purity and just this sense of things being brighter and bigger than they normally are in real life. And that's also something that the romance genre often plays with, where a romance will be purer and deeper much more quickly than maybe normally happens in real life. And so bringing the two of those together seems like kind of a natural fit, because everything in each genre is already enhanced to a level that is in some ways beyond the natural world.
And that's totally true, especially when you're looking at genre blending high fantasy and elements of science fiction too, because in a lot of cases you're looking at almost like a religious element with the science or the mechanical element or the technology element of something. If you're looking at something like Iron Widow, for instance, where there is almost a elemental level religious element to it, which then has a good and evil existence tear, kind of like a conflict going on. I would consider that verging on the edge of high fantasy and science fiction, all kind of blending together.
Absolutely. And another really good example of that for those of you who prefer the classics is like Dune.
Oh,
because
yeah.
it's got the spaceships, it's got the chosen one, which is an epic fantasy trope, the hero that will save the world. But then it's also got the spaceships and the the politics and all of the things that are kind of inherent to that high fantasy genre. And so whether you classify Dune as fantasy or as science fiction, it really pulls from both of those genres.
And if we want to talk about classics, let's talk about the ultimate classic is fairy tales. Fairy tales are many of them are in essence high fantasy, dealing with built worlds of otherworldly creatures. This happens to be a graphic novel that is retellings of queer fairy tales from the YA realm, except you're looking at fairy tales or other high fantasy that exists within children's literature, and there's just so much of it out there. Everything from Rick Riordan, the Lightning Thief, and things like that, to everything to classic elements in fairy tales that you see that exist in children's literature that are still popular to this day. Another element that I think we're touching on a little bit that we see like with remakes that we see coming in Netflix and things, in Dune, for instance, or Wheel of Time, the Amazon series, is diversity that is coming into high fantasy. Everyone thinks high fantasy is just basically whitewashed elves. That is not the case anymore. We're seeing a lot more diverse authors, as well as diverse characters. The Beast of Prey series that we see by Ayana Gray, for instance, this is the last in the series. This is Beast of War, well, the most recent in the series, for instance, just came out this year. Once again, totally made up world, diverse characters, own voices, but own voices in a way, in a fantastical world, in its own made up elements. But we're definitely branching out from the way that high fantasy used to be, which was a representation of just white male authors with their own views from a very specific viewpoint. So
Yeah.
I'm liking where it's going.
So it sounds like between the diversity, between crossovers with science fiction and crossovers with romance, that there really is something that has a little bit of high fantasy in it for everyone, including folks who may not be huge readers. So for example, we have a D&D club at the library,
Yeah.
and Dungeons and Dragons is absolutely set in a high fantasy realm.
Yep.
And there are multiple ways that folks can engage with that. They can play Dungeons and Dragons, either as a tabletop game with friends, or as a video game, or they can read books that have been written about the Dungeons and Dragons world. Or one of my favorite aspects of it is cosplay. So people can absolutely take high fantasy characters or high fantasy tropes and make costumes about them. So for example, we've got this book here, which is The Beginner's Guide to Cosplay Armor and Props, which we have in the library, we loan to folks, and it teaches how to make foam armor and how to drape fabric and how to make costumes so that folks who, maybe really love a world and want to explore it a little bit more physically than perhaps just like reading a book. There are ways for folks to really, really deeply engage with those worlds and kind of become part of the world by putting that world on.
Yeah, and we bring those worlds to life through our D&D clubs, for instance, and actually, for our own plug, we are looking for more dungeon masters. So if anyone is interested in that, teens and adults, please reach out. But also, we bring that to life again through other elements. And once again, we're back through the diversity idea of other games, right? Can you talk about some of our more diverse tabletop games that have a high fantasy element to them?
Sure. So we have a couple different game kits in our library of things. I'm going to be talking about one later in this episode, so I don't want to. I don't want to
spoil it.
Tip my hand there. But Dungeons and Dragons has gotten a lot better recently with bringing in more diverse characters, more women, more people of color, being a little bit more respectful about the way it represents both different races of human, but also different races of types of characters, elves and dwarves and all of that. They've come a long way from their first releases in how they represent folks. But there are also other worlds, if D&D isn't your thing, there are other worlds that exist that you can play in that are a little bit more respectful or may draw on non-European cultures for their inspiration. And so if you're looking at D&D and saying, ugh, that's just a bunch of old white people doing their white people things, there are absolutely games out there that draw on those diverse cultures and backgrounds and stories that can be more representative of lots of different folks.
And for the younger crowd too.
Absolutely.
And we don't always have to restrict that. Looking into even for Tea Dragon Society, for instance, that verges on a high fantasy because of a background and a struggle. And that even has a tabletop and card game too. So
absolutely,
yeah. I love it. It's great.
Fantasy is something that anyone of any age can get into, no matter what sort of thing you like. There's a niche in there for you. And as a fantasy reader, I'm so happy to be able to talk about this today and to be able to introduce people to it.
Well, thank you for bringing me in, Danielle. This is so much fun.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thing of the Month, the segment of the show where we talk about something at the library that's unexpected or that you might not have known about. This month, we're talking about tabletop board games. Now, many of you may have heard of D&D, and Jack and I talked about that a little bit earlier in our segment about the genre of the month, high fantasy. But we also said that there are plenty of games that are in other settings, other areas of the world, or other cultures that may be a little bit more interesting to folks who are just kind of like done with the white high fantasy European genre. So this month I have a D&D or a tabletop game kit with me. We have these at the library. They include all the materials that you need in order to play the game, including a mat that you can draw on to mark your character's progress throughout their journey. We've got some erasable markers in there so that you can draw on that. Dice, which are integral to most tabletop games, as well as the rule book. This game in particular is called Coyote and Crow, and it is absolutely one of my favorite installations in the tabletop genre. It is a setting that is set in what is currently the United States, but it's in an alternate future. So in this world, the colonization of the United States by the Europeans never happened. And so the native peoples who lived in this area were able to continue to develop and grow and flourish and have a technology culture that is totally different from the technology culture, the Western technology culture that we live in today. It's very, very respectful of native traditions and cultures, and it includes notes in it for how you can respect those cultures when you play so that you are not colonizing these cultures by playing as a person who may not be native. It's absolutely fantastic. It's very, very well written. It's really easy to follow along. It's got beautiful, beautiful pictures in it. I recommend checking it out just for the pictures because they are gorgeous. And it's something that the whole family can play. This is something where you can absolutely play with a group of teens or a group of adults. And it's also something where if you simplify some of the rules a little bit, even your littles can get into it. So it's really something that can be fun and engaging for the whole family. We have a couple different kits like this. Of course, we have Dungeons and Dragons. We have this one, which again is Coyote and Crow. We also have Vampire the Masquerade, which is fantastic for all of you urban fantasy fans. And we also have Call of Cthulhu, which is a kind of horror one, which is a little bit better for adults. It's a little bit scary. Thank you so much for joining me for the Thing of the Month, and I hope that you come in and check out all of our games and materials and things that we have available to loan to you. Hi everyone, and welcome to our special guest segment. Today I have Dan Boudreau with us. He is our Adult Services Librarian, and he helps to manage our local history room. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're here to talk about our local history room and local history generally. So can you just talk a little bit about what local history is and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So local history is sort of everything and also sort of nothing. In the local history room, we collect all sorts of things that are either artifacts from town history or pertain to town history, also sometimes about places near Hopkinton or events that have happened in Hopkinton, like the Boston Marathon. And it's really important because it is a big part of our cultural memory and recording the past and the things that have happened in Hopkinton. It's probably not a surprise to most people that a small town like Hopkinton doesn't often make it into the big U.S. history textbooks that you get in high school. So local history rooms at public libraries are a great way for us to preserve the small pieces of history around the country.
That's fascinating. So if I were to walk into the local history room today, what sorts of materials might I see in there?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of everything. We have, as you might imagine, we have books. We have different types of paper materials like essays written by people about town history. We have a lot of photographs. We have some old journals from people who lived in town. We have bank registers. I believe we have one hotel logbook. And then we also have some sort of one-off artifacts and items, some of which are relating to the Boston Marathon. So I have 3 medals from a marathon that took place in Greece in 2010, I believe, and that were given to the town of Hopkinton because of our connection with the marathon.
Wow, those are some really fascinating pieces of town history that we've got in there. And you've been digging through this room recently, partially because you're new and starting to just get used to what's in there, and partially because you're doing some work in there for the upcoming marathon. What is one thing that you've run into in there that really just kind of blew your mind a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the more unique items that we have is, it's about this large. It is a wooden drawer that contains, I believe, 5 metal plates that were used by the Bank of Hopkinton back in the day to print money, actually. So there's $1 denominations, there's a $5, and then there's a $10. And these metal plates, they were X'd out and scored over, so no, you can't print money with them now. But they're sitting in this drawer, and at one point, this drawer and the plates survived a fire. One part of the drawer is actually burned off. You can still see the ashes and the charcoal on it, which makes it a little bit problematic from a keeping things clean standpoint, because it's always shedding all this charcoal everywhere. But it's really cool because it's not something you see every day, and it also has a little bit of history of its own. It survived a fire. It's been around for quite a while. I'm not sure exactly when the fire was or how old the plates are. I'm still working on that, but at least 100 years old from what I can tell. Oh, and I almost forgot, the plates themselves have these beautiful etchings of workers in a boot factory, actually, like at work making boots. So they also, they are a piece of Hopkinton history, but they also portray Hopkinton history and the heritage of manufacture in the town.
Wow, that piece sounds really fascinating. So say someone wanted to come in and take a look at some of these items or see what else we have. How would they go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really easy. You just drop by. The local history room is available to patrons anytime the library is open. It will close 45 minutes before the library closes, so we ask that you make sure to plan your research accordingly. But you don't need to make an appointment. You don't need to have any sort of credentials. You can just come on by. We do ask if you want significant research help from staff, give us a heads up in advance. We can pull some materials. We can look through our finding aid and see what we might have that might be useful. But that isn't necessary if you're just kind of curious and want to poke around a little bit.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dan, to talk to folks about our local history room.
Thank you, Danielle.
Hello, and welcome to On the Horizon, the part of the show where we talk about what's coming up at the library. I have Jack Miller with me here, again, our assistant director. You've seen a lot of her today. We're going to see a little more. So Jack, can you tell me a little bit about some programs that you have coming up at the library that you want to talk about?
Yeah, definitely. So as I've transitioned away from being the YA librarian into my assistant director role, I've taken with me a couple of my programs. One of them is my Frayed Knots, which is our stitching group at the library, where we're transitioning from Wednesday nights onto Thursday nights. And so we're going to be now on the second Thursday of each month, starting in May.
Cool. And you also do appointments if people want a little bit more of like skill building or something like that they can't get in the bigger group, right?
Yes. So for Frayed Knots, it's people just show up. And so it's a drop-in sort of thing where you can bring any kind of hand stitching, whether that's crochet or knitting, paper piece quilting, or cross stitch, needlepoint, really anything you can do. And it's really more of a social club where you just chit chat and we can help each other with our projects. But if you're looking to, for instance, learn to crochet or do basic knitting, or if you want to do more advanced crochet, that's my specialty, you can set up an appointment with me. All you have to do is send me an email, and we will link that at the end of this video. And then once you do that, you can set up an individual appointment. I do hour appointments at a time, and I can either do small group or individual, and I will teach you. And you don't need anything. We have that all at the library, which was very, very nicely funded by the Friends of the Library. And you then can develop your crochet skills and either join our Frayed Knots group, or you can just continue with me to continue to build your skills.
Great, that sounds fantastic.
So what do you have that's new coming up?
So I am starting a new book club here at the library. It is called RIP, Read in Peace, the Silent Book Club.
Ooh.
And if you're not familiar with the concept of a silent book club, it's pretty much what it sounds like. You come, you bring your book, or you pick out a book on your way into the library, and you pop in a chair, and then you just read silently by yourself. So if you're someone who doesn't really like talking to other people or doesn't really like to share what you're reading, but you still kind of want a community of readers, this is fantastic for you.
Can I read a magazine?
Absolutely. You can read whatever
anything?
you want, as long as you're not talking.
That's great.
Don't talk to us.
Where are you going to hold this?
So that's going to be on the lower level of the library. It's going to be the second Tuesday of the month, and we are starting in April. And then we're just going to keep on going. And you don't need to register or anything. Just pop on down, grab a chair, do your reading. Don't talk to anyone. We don't want to hear you. You don't want to hear us. It's fine.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Jack. But wait, this month we want to know about a character whose fashion sense you're totally into. Tell us about the character whose wardrobe you would steal, and you have a chance to be featured in our next episode. Bye!